Welcome to The Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us as usual. Now, more people have been infected by COVID in Brazil than any of its neighboring countries, and more people have died there as well. Amidst this, Brazil's Nero, who is fiddling while Rome is burning, is his president, Jair Bolsonaro, who told Brazilians to stay on the job and work, who says he is too physically fit to get the disease, and he calls it no more than sniffles, while telling the people of Brazil, and this is a quote, "Some will die, I'm sorry. That's life." The revolt against him is palpable. His own health minister, who he threatened to fire, came out against what he said. 24 of the 27 state governors, representing 200 million people out of the 210 million people in Brazil, have put their citizens on lockdown, both defying and criticizing Bolsonaro. What could happen in Brazil? Could this be the downfall of Bolsonaro or the opposite? What happens to the people of Brazil? We turn to Michael Fox, journalist, documentary filmmaker, and frequent contributor to The Real News, joining us now from southern Brazil. And Mike, welcome back. Good to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this is what's going on in Brazil right now. As I kind of read all these things, and you're in the midst of it, what I read from yesterday was that Brazil already has 11,000 confirmed cases, 486 deaths. It's still rising. So talk a bit about this tenor of the land at the moment.
Yeah, well, and it's now over 500 deaths just this morning. So it's increasing, and it's going to continue to increase. Thankfully, the country, like you just said, the state governments have been able to really put the country as much as possible on lockdown. Brazil is not a country that follows rules very well. Brazilians don't like to follow rules. And so that means that unless there is it's a very clear lockdown, you need to stay home. People are going to be out in the streets. They're going to do what they want to do. And we're still seeing that. So regardless, despite the lockdown, you're still getting people out in the streets. But the big question, the big thing that everybody's been talking about really is Bolsonaro's take on this crisis and kind of the infighting within this government right now. Obviously, people are scared. They're afraid. They don't know where this could head because there are millions and millions. I mean, Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Poverty has been rising in recent years since the 2016 coup. And so those people are even more under strain right now. You have indigenous communities, you have Quilombola communities, Black communities and so this COVID-19, this coronavirus is really, people are nervous about what could happen going forward in the coming weeks and the coming months.
So let's take some of these things you just talked about. I mean, let's start with the politics of this for a moment, but I want to get to the favelas and the indigenous communities and talk about what's happening there that we're not seeing and kind of the dangers there. But you have in Brazil right now even his own health minister, if I have his name right, Mandetta, right?
That's right.
So he came out, actually saying that Bolsonaro was wrong, that and pushing back, and Bolsonaro threatened to fire him. And now you have 23 of the 27 state governors saying that we have to go on lockdown and actually defying and criticizing Bolsonaro. So what are the politics of Corona as they stand now?
So you have several things that are happening. First off, I think it's important to look at the very latest polls. According to a Datafolha survey that was released just a couple days ago, 76% of the country are in favor, actually support Mandetta. 76% of the country are in favor of the lockdowns. And over 50% of the population, according to this latest survey, says that Bolsonaro is doing more to harm the fight against coronavirus than he is to help it. So that's just kind of a quick vision of how Brazilians are seeing kind of this moment, right? That's how come every single time Bolsonaro appears on national television, you have people banging pots and pans, protesting his government across the country. He's actually been kind of rolling back his intense criticism of the quarantines and of the lockdowns just in recent days. But you have several different things that are happening. First off, Bolsonaro says that the economy is number one. This is kind of what he ran on. And so he's been saying, listen, we got to get people to work. We got to get back in the streets. He's afraid of what could happen. And partially he's afraid of it because he's actually been selling off the dollar reserves that Brazil has. He's been privatized the country. That's been kind of him and his neoliberal finance minister Paulo Guedes, that's been kind of the goal. So this has rolled back their ability to do that, and they've actually had to approve some anti-cyclical measures. For instance, one of the things that the Senate approved last week is a 600 real, so about $114 stipend for informal workers. So this is going to benefit millions of informal workers in the country. This is approved by the Senate. It's been signed into law by Bolsonaro, and they say that it could roll out this week. So this is the government that's been trying to privatize, and now it actually has to offer this support to communities in need. So on the one hand, you have the economy, which Bolsonaro says is foremost, that people have to get back to work. At the other hand, you have an evangelical community that is huge. It's been rising in recent years. 25% of Brazil is now evangelical. And these people have been staunch supporters of Bolsonaro. And that's how come Bolsonaro, he called yesterday for a day of prayer and a day of fast against coronavirus. And you had people praying and fasting. You have some of the major churches have been open during this crisis. And in fact, some of the major supporters of Bolsonaro, the evangelical priests, have said that no one is going to get coronavirus in our churches. So you have these different politics that are happening kind of underneath all of this at the same time. And Bolsonaro is really trying to play to his base. It's the same thing that Donald Trump did for a long time, until it got too much, until it actually became a crisis he could not handle. And that's kind of what we're seeing at this point. He's been speaking to his base. Bolsonaro knows that he has about a third of the country. That's been his approval rating, and that's been his support since the very beginning, and he knows that's going to stay the same. We've also seen this rise in fake news, kind of like what we've seen in the US and elsewhere, and this rise in conspiracy theories. People are talking about how the New World Order, and that's what really is behind this coronavirus, that it's not real, that's not really a big deal. It's really about the New World Order trying to take over, and Bolsonaro is trying to fight that. So you have all these tensions that are happening. Obviously, the politics in the middle of his government are huge. 24 top members of his government have themselves come down with the coronavirus, which they contracted during their trip to visit with Donald Trump last month. So the irony here is absolutely fantastic. And but within his government, obviously, he's been saying a lot of things, and they have been really, and they've just been fighting against it. He's gotten into fights with these state governors, and they've really been able to push back on this. Thankfully, Bolsonaro is really not the one guiding the country in terms of coronavirus policies. Thankfully, that could save the country.
So, I mean, when you look at this, I mean, so politically, this could go either way. I mean, we just don't, same here with Trump, or in Britain with Boris, or whatever else. This can go either way politically, depending on how this tumbles out. I mean, if the 23 governors are successful in limiting the spread of the virus in their states with their lockdowns, it actually could go to Bolsonaro's benefit. I mean, I don't want people dying in Brazil, but I want the governors to do what they're doing, but this could also go to the benefit of Bolsonaro in the end, saying, look, see, we made it through. I mean, all that's all possible.
Absolutely. I mean, right now, everything is up in the air. That's what we know that COVID-19 has done. And it's anyone's guess what this is going to look like in a couple of months, 5 or 6 months from now. We do know that, for instance, Trump's approval ratings have been rising. Bolsonaro's have stayed kind of steady at this point. It's really hard to say what could happen going forward. Bolsonaro, like Trump, is not someone to apologize. He's not going to come out in the end and say, oh, yeah, sorry, that was crazy of me. I shouldn't have done that. He's going to come out. He's going to take responsibility for whatever happened, unless something bad happens and millions die. And then he's going to try and blame that on everybody else. So we know that those are the policies. We know that that's the discourse. That's the way that they're seeing it, and they're trying to angle it however best they can. But we have no clue what's going to happen going forward here politically here in Brazil.
So let me move the conversation a bit here to actually the people of Brazil, and two deeply affected parts of Brazil in terms of population: the indigenous people and the people living in the favelas, the slums in the cities of Brazil. But let me start with the indigenous population. I mean, that's been one of Bolsonaro's battles, taking away the rights of indigenous people, opening up to mining and logging. The governors of Amazonia and the other provinces are right-wingers. And the indigenous people are terrified this disease is going to come in and wipe them out, like other diseases have in the past several hundred years. You even had, and you can tell us more about this, an indigenous leader was just killed 2 days ago. So what about that dynamic?
Absolutely. This is probably the major population here in Brazil that people are most concerned about is Brazil's almost a million indigenous population, almost a million indigenous peoples. So, and they're spread out all around northern Brazil, throughout the south. You have various different dynamics that are happening, but everybody is extremely nervous. I've been talking with indigenous leaders over the last few days, over the last couple of weeks. I was in the Amazon about 2.5 weeks ago, met with indigenous communities, visited their homes, and even then they were very nervous about what kind of an impact this could have and why. Just like you mentioned, Mark, it was back just a couple of years ago where a major bout of the flu ran through many indigenous communities outside of Altamira. More than 100 members of indigenous tribes had to be taken out of their territory and brought to hospitals. Children died, and people are very afraid of the potential of this happening the same way if it spreads in these communities because they're so far isolated, right? So, how do you get them medical attention if they have to be brought to a hospital? That it's many of these communities, it takes days to get in and out unless you have a plane. There's so many questions, and you also don't necessarily want to bring a doctor into many of these communities, a doctor who might himself or herself be contagious with the virus. That's what's so complicated about this moment, right? So I was speaking with Andre Caripuna from the Caripuna community out in Rondônia. I was speaking with him last night, and he said, listen, we're on lockdown. We're not leaving. I've told everyone that they're used to traveling back and forth every month or every 2 months to the city. He said, we're not going anywhere unless it's an absolute emergency, and we're hoping to just wait this thing out. Now, what's really complicated is at the same time as this is happening with coronavirus, you still have the invasions in indigenous communities by illegal loggers, by illegal miners, and that's what happened just a couple of days ago. Like you said, with another death from this indigenous community in Maranhão, in the easternmost Amazonian state of Maranhão. So these communities, they're still kind of invading indigenous territories, and the fear from indigenous communities is that with more people on lockdown, with less inspections going on from the Brazilian government, that can then empower land grabbers and illegal loggers to really push further into the Amazon and push forward even faster than before into indigenous communities. You have 20,000 illegal miners, according to reports, just in the Yanomami territory alone in Roraima and Amazonas, right near the Venezuelan border. 20,000 illegal miners. And the fear is, and they have contact with the community, so the fear is they can also be spreading this disease to the Yanomami community. So there's so many things that are happening, and that's not even to get into the reality with the fires. In another couple of months, it's going to be summertime up there. Things are going to be hot. The fire is going to start again because they were started last year by landowners clearing land and by people trying to push into indigenous territories. They're most likely going to happen again. But how are people going to put out those fires if everybody is still on lockdown? Because right now it's also important to look at, in Brazil, we have a situation where in the United States, you're heading into the summer. So people are encouraged by that might help to slow the push of coronavirus around the country. Brazil's headed into winter. So it's the exact opposite. People are very nervous about the spikes that could happen in the coming months as the weather starts to get colder.
And the other population to talk about here are the people who live in the favelas all through Brazil. I mean, there was a quote that I read in the BBC this morning by Gilson Rodriguez, who was the leader of one of the favelas, who said Jair Bolsonaro will be partly responsible for any deaths because he's creating the situation. It's as if the 13 million people who live in the slums in Brazil don't exist. There's been no policy to look after the country's favelas. We're here left to defend for ourselves. So I mean, so that's another situation which involves a huge portion of Afro-Brazilians as well as other Brazilians.
Absolutely. I spoke with an infectious doctor, retired infectious doctor, just a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying this is his biggest concern is the inequality in Brazil and the very high poverty, because what Brazil has going for it is a universal public health system, but that is not spread equally around the country. And so people in the favelas, A, have more difficult access to healthcare, and B, they're living in very, very difficult situations. They're in much more dense populations. 40 million people don't have access to water. And so that's a major issue in the favelas. And almost half of Brazilians, there is no treatment of water systems, right? So there is no public treatment, sewage treatment systems. So that means that they're now in Brazil seeing how this virus could be surviving in the sewers as well. So that's a whole other question. But I was speaking with a woman who lives in the Parque das Missões favela just last night, which is just north of Rio de Janeiro. She was out yesterday bringing food to poor communities kind of in her own neighborhood and also in other neighborhoods nearby. Where she lives is an area which is just built of shacks. It's right along a polluted waterfront. The streets are dirt. Many of the people, they survive by going out and selling things in the streets. They survive by cutting hair. They survive by just barely making ends meet, housekeeping. Now they can't get out because of the quarantine. And they're okay with quarantine, but they have no means of survival. She said she spoke with a little boy who was so happy that she was bringing some food. He said he had been that night, because they had nothing to eat, he had been sucking on his pillowcase, imagining that it was food. So this is the situation that's happening literally right now in Rio de Janeiro. And it's extremely complicated because it's not like the state officials, whether it's the government, federal, or even local, are out in these communities. They're supporting these people. People should be at home. They shouldn't have to be worrying about food. But even the state officials aren't out doing this work. Now, like I mentioned, it was passed by the Senate just last week. So there is a 600 real stipend that's going to go to members of the informal economy. And that should help. And they said it should start to be distributed this week, but it hasn't been distributed yet. And we don't know how long it's going to take. And so right now, people are just in these very precarious situations.
So one quick thing before we close, another question here, is that they read the quote, they said 13 million people living in favelas, but my other reading tells me there's a great deal more people living in favelas and in poverty in Brazil, not just 13 million out of 210. I mean, that's Absolutely. A little skewed, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, there are much more. It could be 13 million in Rio itself,
right.
And in the state of Rio as well,
right.
Because outside of Sao Paulo, you have massive regions, favelas, and you have favelas, in every major city that ring the city. The favelas are created by people that move into the city to try and look for work, and they find a way to build their home on top to another, and then over time they become these neighborhoods and communities and whatnot. So no, the poverty rate has been increasing in recent years, and whether or not you're living in favela, if you're living week to week or day to day, this moment of having to be at home in quarantine is extremely hard.
I mean, so it just appears to me like this is a hugely volatile situation in Brazil. We don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, many people could die and get really sick from the coronavirus in Brazil, the way Bolsonaro is handling things, and especially given the poverty and what's happening in indigenous communities. On the other hand, you have all these governors of these states who are both right-wingers and left-wingers and in between as well, that are saying, basically giving Bolsonaro the finger, saying, we're doing this ourselves because you're incompetent and we have to save the people of our communities. So the question is politically and socially, in terms of corona, I mean, anything could happen now. There's no way to be even slightly prescient about what's about to happen.
This is why people, absolutely, and this is why people are so concerned. I mean, even the governor in the state where we live, Santa Catarina, this is largely a right-wing state. He's a member of the PSL, which is Bolsonaro's party. And it was clear about a week and a half ago that he was being pressured from Bolsonaro to change his stance. So he said a week and a half ago he was going to lift the quarantine starting as of last week, starting Monday, and opening everything up as of Wednesday. He pushed that off, and it's been pushed off again. But you can tell that he wants to get things going. He wants to bring things. He wants to get the economy rolling, just like Bolsonaro. Now, things are obviously increasing. They don't want the pandemic to get out of proportion. Brazil has the highest percentage of respirators per population than anywhere else in Latin America. But it still is not substantial and not enough to fulfill the need of the population. They're building field hospitals in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro right now. But that's just it. We don't know how bad this is going to get. And that is really the big question. At some point a while back, the health minister said that at least half the population was going to have to be infected before this whole thing was over. Now, that would be over 100 million people. And if you look at a death rate of roughly 1% to 2%, then we're talking about potentially as many as 1 to 2 million Brazilians. But again, if they're able to keep people in their homes, if they're able to push this thing forward and get us over the hump, then it might not be that bad. The estimates according to the research go from anywhere to, you know, a couple 100,000 being being infected to millions. So it's all up in the air. We really don't know where this is going forward.
Well, Mike Fox, we always appreciate your work with us, and I look forward to what you bring to us for Brazil, whether it's your documentaries or our conversations here as this unfolds. And thank you so much for your work, and thanks for being with us here today.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark.
And stay healthy. Good luck to you and your wife.
You too.
And I'm Mark Steiner here for the Real News Network. We want all of you to stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll be talking together soon.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.